Hi, my name is Morgan and I am a neuroscience researcher. This week I thought that we would change things up a little bit. It's been a little while since I've done a neuroscience history video, so of course I'll link my other neuroscience history video somewhere up here. But this week I thought it would be fun to go over one of my favorite stories in neuroscience and one that I loved so much that I got it tattooed on my body. So you'll notice that I'm wearing a tank top today. That is to show off my awesome science sleeve. And this lovely skull belongs to a man named Phineas Gage. And his is the story that I'm going to be telling this week. If you would like to see more videos on my science tattoos, all of them have some sort of backstory. I'd be happy to make more videos about being modified in STEM. Just leave a comment below. So as always, I'll be linking all of my sources in the description below, but I'm also going to be linking a Sawbones episode. Sawbones is a medical history podcast that I really enjoy, and they did a whole episode on Phineas Gage that I thought was really informative and gave some perspectives that I hadn't heard before, so I really recommend checking it out. So Phineas Gage was a 25-year-old man who was working in Vermont on the railroad in 1848, which I know is a while ago, but this is neuroscience history. And the reason why he is such an interesting case is because if you'll see this giant bar going through his skull, that's what happened to him, is he had a railway tamping rod shot through his skull and he survived and lived to tell the tale. And this is why Phineas Gage is so interesting. So he was working on the railway and he was a construction foreman, and specifically what his job was is that he did this, and he oversaw a team of people who did this. They blasted holes in mountains to get the railway through. The way that they made those holes in the mountain was that they would take an old-timey version of a drill a hole into a rock, and then fill the rock with blasting powder of some sort and a fuse, and then you would use a tamping rod to pack in sand or clay or something to keep the dynamite in there. That way, whenever it exploded, it would explode the rock behind it and not just come out towards you. And wherever you were doing this, you had to be extremely careful, because if you're sticking a rod into this hole in the rock, the odds that you create a spark where you've just put blasting powder are pretty high. So you have to be extremely, extremely careful. But Phineas Gage was an expert. He was a foreman, so he was leading a crew of people who did this. And he was such an expert that he had his own custom tamping rod made. So this was like his thing. Like, he knew exactly what he was doing. Until one fateful day in 1848. So there's still a lot of debate over exactly what happened, because this is back in the olden days, and it was all passed through word of mouth for a really long time, and passed through like people saw it happen, but there's obviously no video of it happening. So we don't know exactly what happened, but there's two different versions of the story that get passed around most commonly. So the first version of the story is just that, like I said, he had a custom tamping rod made, and the one that ended up going through his skull wasn't his custom tamping rod. So he was for sure using a rod that he was a little less familiar with. You know, you have your own tools to do a job, and if you end up having to use someone else's tools for whatever reason, you might not do as well because you're not used to those. So there's that possibility. And then the other version of the story is a little bit more interesting. It's that one of his workers called out to him as he was tamping in this the sand into this hole, and he was turning around to sort of ask, like, hey, what's happening, and see what his worker was talking about. And as he was turning, he hit the rod just wrong and created a spark. But no matter what, he created a spark, and the tamping rod flew through the air, through his left cheek, up through his left eye socket, and out through his frontal lobe. I don't know why I was showing you with my hand. This is exactly where it went. It went like this through his skull, and he just stumbled backwards a little bit. So he stumbled. He obviously couldn't see out of his left eye immediately after that happened, but according to like witness reports, he was totally fine, and he he sort of like went back over to his cart and started writing down in his notebook what had happened. And I'm amazed. And supposedly he didn't even really notice what had happened. I guess it happened so quickly that he just, like, he knew that the tamping rod had gotten blown away from him, but I guess it happened so suddenly that he didn't realize that it had blown away from him through him. This man. Oh, and then the tamping rod landed several feet away and was, quote, smeared with brains. So that's something, and that must have been something for those workers to see. Obviously, the workers went and got a doctor, and the doctor who ended up responding was named John Harlow. And John Harlow is extremely important to the story because he knew Phineas Gage before the incident. So John Harlow, prior to the incident, had described Phineas Gage as, quote, a perfectly healthy, strong, and active young man possessing an iron will as well as an iron frame. Which, if you think about it, is a little bit ironic because it was an iron tamping rod that went through his skull. But basically he described Phineas Gage as like a totally normal dude for back then. So John Harlow went to check on Phineas Gage on the day of the incident, right after it had happened, or I guess as quickly as he could get there. And Phineas Gage supposedly told him, quote, here is business enough for you. Which Phineas Gage is just one of the most hardcore people in all of history, and he is so cool. Supposedly after the incident, Phineas Gage bled out of his wound for 2 days, which is not super surprising considering the amount of tissue that it went through, and also that it went through his brain, and his body was just trying to repair the damage that had happened. Also, after he was done bleeding for 2 days, I guess, he developed an infection that left him semi-conscious for several months, and he was actually in such a bad condition that they built a casket for him. They thought that he was about to die, but he didn't. He pulled through it, and he lived to the age of 36, which is living 12 years without most of your frontal lobe. So this is a really amazing event in neuroscience history. Honestly, it would be an amazing event on its own, just as the statement that a man had a tamping rod shoved through his brain and he survived. That on its own would be amazing. But like I said, the key to this story is that this Dr. Harlow knew Phineas Gage before the incident, and then he followed up with Phineas Gage after the incident, and he noticed some changes. He said that Phineas Gage's friends said that Phineas was, quote, no longer Gage. So he had a lot of personality changes that were apparently very distinct. A couple of the symptoms that Gage supposedly had were that he couldn't stick to plans. He uttered, quote, the grossest profanity, and he didn't seem to care as much about his friends or about being on time to things. He really had like a disregard for people. And he was supposedly, quote, exceedingly capricious and childish, which is the new best insult if you ever want to throw that around. Dr. Harlow said that Gage had, quote, a child in his intellectual capacity and manifestations, and he has the animal passions of a strong man. So I'm not totally sure what that means, but it doesn't sound like a great thing. And according to Dr. Harlow, this isn't who Phineas Gage was before the incident. He didn't act like this before. He really cared about his friends. He was always on time to things. He remembered things pretty well. Apparently he never uttered the grossest profanities. So this is just a really amazing case. After recovering from his injuries, Gage tried to go back to his job with the railway company, but due to his personality changes, the railway company that had previously said that he was a model foreman and one of their best employees refused to take him back. They wouldn't accept him. So he ended up driving some carriages for a little while, and he also traveled with Barnum Circus with his tamping rod and would just pose for people and show off that he had survived, I guess. He did eventually die. Like I said, this story happened in 1848. It's not likely that he's still alive today, but he ended up dying at the age of 36, 12 years after the incident, and he died of a series of several seizures, probably related to the injury, but it's still amazing that he was able to live for so long, and for this doctor to have been able to study him and know that the changes that had happened. And this was really revolutionary, like I said, not only because he survived this injury, but because this is back in a time when we still believed in phrenology, which, if you don't know what phrenology is, it's people used to think that they could feel your skull and know things about your brain and your personality. And it was based on some really racist roots. I definitely plan to do a video on it sometime and talk about that. But we really didn't know anything about the brain. We didn't really know what its function was or what was happening up there or what all it controlled. And so this was the first time that someone was able to say, look, that person got a brain injury. Their personality changed. The brain has something to do with personality, which doesn't sound like a revolutionary statement nowadays, but this was absolutely revolutionary to be able to say brain injuries can lead to personality changes, and therefore there's something in the brain controlling personality. It was just a wild concept. And it was still a wild concept for 20 years after Phineas Gage's death. Approximately 20 years after Phineas Gage died, there was a man who came along named David Furrier, and he did some animal experiments where he took out parts of the frontal lobe. So the frontal lobe is where Gage was injured. So the frontal lobe is this front part. Specifically, the part that Gage injured was probably the left frontal lobe, very close to the front, so somewhere right around here. And this is the part that David Furrier took out of some animals. He did this to some monkeys, I believe. And what he found was that they had distinct personality shifts. He saw that whenever he removed parts of the frontal lobe, the animal would not be paralyzed, it wouldn't have any physical symptoms, but it would have personality shifts. Just like what Phineas Gage experienced. He was never paralyzed from this. He went blind, but that's likely due to eye damage from the rod going through his eye socket. But the rest of his body was really fine. It was just these personality changes that were odd. So through the case study of Phineas Gage and the experiments done by David Furrier, society was sort of eventually brought on to the idea that your brain is part of your personality and creates part of your personality and who you are. There's been a lot of modern experiments to see exactly what would happen in Phineas Gage and what maybe did happen, and a lot of the evidence suggests that really his symptoms probably only lasted for 2 to 3 years. He probably was not that different for most of his life after it. A lot of studies show that people with brain injuries can sort of be rehabilitated, and they may not be back to 100%, but they can fit back in with society afterwards. So it's likely that Phineas Gage's symptoms didn't actually last for the whole 12 years afterwards. If you're interested in seeing Phineas Gage, his skull and his tamping rod are both on display at the Warren Anatomical Museum in Boston. So feel free to go and visit that. It's supposedly one of their main attractions. Something that I think is really interesting is that there's the potential that this didn't happen. So, obviously, we have Phineas Gage's skull, so we know that Phineas Gage was shot through the head with a tamping rod. We also have a picture of Phineas Gage afterwards, so we know that he was alive after he was shot with the tamping rod. But what we don't know is his personality shift. There are some other people who are close to him. I believe his wife maybe wrote a statement saying that these personality shifts that other people said that they saw weren't real, that they didn't actually happen, that they might have been like some minor personality shifts, but nothing to the extent of what like the doctor and Phineas Gage's friends described. So there's the possibility that he didn't really have that many symptoms, but he's still such an important part of neuroscience, and I think he's an important story for a lot of us. This is a story that a lot of psychology classes and even some biology classes will sort of open with. A lot of teachers will use it on like the first week, and it's a lot of people's first exposure to neuroscience. So it's really important in the grand scheme of history. It was the first time that we considered that the brain could lead to personality and could create personality and had something to do with who you are. But it's also the first time that a lot of us, even today, realize how important neuroscience is. I know for me, Phineas Gage is one of the first stories that I heard that involved the brain, really, and involved neuroscience, and showed how neuroscience can affect our everyday life. That one event could happen to you very quickly, and if it affects your brain, it could affect the rest of your life. It could affect your relationships with others. And I just thought that was amazing, and it was crazy that that was a possibility. And so I hope that maybe this story has inspired you. It definitely inspired me as a young scientist to go and look more into the brain, and then we see where that led. But I hope that you have enjoyed hearing this story. I think Phineas Gage is an amazing story to talk about, and an amazing story to look into the history of neuroscience and what we used to believe and what we believe now. There's some crazy stuff that we used to believe, and I think that it's really interesting to look at how far we've come and see how much further we still have to go. So like I said, all of the sources for this video are linked in the description, as well as that podcast episode. If you'd like to see more videos on neuroscience history, if you'd like maybe a neuroscience tattoo video, I can do those. Anything that you're interested in, feel free to ask a neuroscientist. That's me. And you can also reach out to me on all of my social medias. I'll list them all here and in the description. You can email me video topic suggestions or questions that you might have. You can also just leave them in a comment. And I hope that you come back next Wednesday for another video. Bye.